Have you ever been to a shopping center Irish pub? You know the kind of place I'm talking about, where it's like a grocery store, then a yoga studio, then a FedEx Kinko's, and then an Irish pub, all in the same parking lot. It's usually in a relatively good neighborhood and ample parking and zero curb appeal. And usually a place like that, to make up for their lack of authenticity or any kind of aesthetic, for a place like that to survive, to do well, to thrive economically, usually they have to have amazing food and some sort of gimmick, themed nights, so to speak. When I was a fourth year seminarian in St. Louis, Missouri, the seminary is actually located in this really nice part of town called Clayton. A lot of money there. And across the street from the seminary is a Schnucks, a Bikram yoga studio, a FedEx Kinko's, and Mike Duffy's Tavern. Duffy's has really good food and themed nights. Every Wednesday night at Duffy's was trivia night. And so a bunch of seminarians would go across the street, usually with our wives and our friends, and sit down at a big table, 15 or 20 of us, and compete in trivia night and eat our weight in delicious cheesy bacon waffle fries. Trivia night in the Midwest is kind of a phenomenon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but y'all show up, you have a team name and a piece of paper, and a guy reads questions, and you write your answers down on paper and rush it up to the front. And if you're right, you get points. And if you win the night, you get gift cards for more cheesy bacon waffle fries. Lots of good memories on a Wednesday night at Duffy's with my closest friends, who are now scattered all over the country. One particular Wednesday night, when I was a fourth year seminarian, I'd already had a little bit of ministry under my belt as a vicar here in Phoenix. I did my internship year actually participating in church work after years and years of study and intense focus. I'd actually tried my hand at ministering to people and to preaching and to running a youth group. And I kind of thought I knew what I was doing at that point. And one Wednesday, I'm settling up my tab, paying for the waffle fries at the bar, and I've got a little notebook with me, and I walk up next to this guy that's sitting at the bar, and I'm waiting to pay my bill, to sign the receipt and all that. And he looks over and notices my little notebook, which has a piece of tape across the front, and it says sermon ideas. And he said, "Oh, you're a preacher." And I always like when somebody, when I was a seminarian, I used to like when somebody would say, "Are you a preacher?" Because since I frequently engaged in preaching, I could say yes. If they said, "Are you a pastor?" I would have to say no for another 6 months, even though I had been doing church work. You're not a pastor in the Lutheran Church until you get the stamp at your ordination and you get a call at a congregation. So he said, "Are you a preacher?" And I was relieved and got to say yes and didn't have to explain the whole process of seminary to him. And he said, "Oh, I loathe religion," which was not what I was expecting him to say at all. I thought maybe there was another L word that he was going to say, but sure enough, he explained to me that that he had grown up Catholic and that he's very familiar with Christianity and with the Bible, but that was his stance. He loathed religion, and I could tell from an empty glass and a partially full glass in front of him that he was having a rough day. So I asked if he wanted to talk about what's been going on, and he proceeded to tell me one of the most heartbreaking stories I'd ever heard. He was having the kind of week that I think some of us have been having recently, where the bad things, the challenging things, the traumatic things, were just kind of piling on top of each other for this guy. Joe, his name was, told me that that earlier in the week, his little godson, who lived in California, was accidentally struck by a car and did not survive. This little kid, toddler, what had happened was somebody who was really advanced in age had kind of lost control of her vehicle and it had gone up onto the sidewalk and struck this little boy. And he was heartbroken over that. And he said, well, and on top of that, I just got back from the Siteman Center earlier that night. The Siteman Center is like Mayo. It's the kind of place you go for a very specific medical reason, and usually you're being treated for something that you likely won't survive. And that was the case for who Joe was visiting. His best friend's fiance, Nicole, had just been given the prognosis that she wouldn't last until the wedding, that she was gonna die before the date that they had set to be married. And so they were all talking about what to do and how to move up the wedding and whether or not that was worth the expense that it was going to be, and what to do. And he was just having such a rough day. And me, with all of my experience as a church worker, I said, Joe, man, I know how you feel about religion, but could I pray with you? And he said no, which is another thing that doesn't happen that often. He said, no, man, I grew up in the church. I know all about Jesus. I was baptized. I took CCD. I learned all the doctrine. I know that Jesus lived and that he died for us and that he was buried and that he rose from the dead. And then he flew away and abandoned us. He said, you can pray for me if you want to, but I'm not going to pray with you. I'm not going to pray to that. I want you to think about the experience that the disciples had on Ascension Day. The day when after having been raised from the dead and after having spent 40 more days opening the scriptures to his disciples and explaining how everything that happened to him and everything that will happen to his body, the church, it all had to happen the way it was going to happen according to the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms. It was always going to be that way. But that was the plan. Jesus had spent all this time with them, explaining to them, opening their minds, opening their hearts, helping them to see that Jesus actually, he won. He defeated death in the grave, and he's victorious, and he's reunited with his disciples. And then one morning, he leads them up to a mountain, and he leaves them. When we read the story of Ascension Day, I think a lot of us read it as if we know how the disciples felt. We read it and we think that Jesus flew away and left us to figure out this life mostly on our own. He did some incredible things on our behalf, and then now this life is up to us because he's gone. And on the surface, it might seem that way when you read the Ascension story. You try to imagine what the disciples were experiencing. You try to imagine you were a part of everything that happened in those few months of the first Easter season. Spend all this time with Jesus, learning about the life that he has for us, for all of us. You come to be certain, absolutely convinced that he is true life himself. And even though you saw those monsters kill him in front of your very eyes, he comes back from the dead and proves to you that he wins, that he's victorious, that nothing can stop what he came to start, not even death. And then you get to spend 40 days with him, and he's explaining how the scriptures pointed to all of this the whole time. And he's training you to live out the truth that he showed you and to spread it as far and as wide as your legs and boats and planes and internet can take you. And then you, with the disciples, you say, is now the time that you're going to bring heaven to earth like you promised? Is the kingdom of God coming now? And then Jesus says, no. And then he leaves. And his feet haven't touched the ground since then. For the disciples, and for you, if you're reading yourself into this story, you can read it in a way where you assume that they felt incredible absence, that they felt a loss of leadership, a loss of intimacy with Jesus, a loss of protection from the one that they've come to know is God, the author of the universe and life itself. You imagine them standing there staring up into the clouds, because the Acts passage actually says, as Jesus was ascending, they just stood there staring. And you got to imagine that they were wondering where he went, wondering when he's going to come back, wondering what in the world they're supposed to do now. At first glance, you can read the ascension story as a story of loss, as a story that needs to be grieved and mourned. But what's weird about the ascension story, if you actually read it, is when the disciples leave the Mount of Olives, when they head back down the mountain into the city, it doesn't seem like they're sad at all. They go back worshiping. Luke 24:44-53. Jesus said to them, these are my words that I spoke, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms had to be fulfilled. And then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, this is what's written, that the Christ would suffer and on the third day would rise from the dead. And after that, repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in the Christ's name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, you are witnesses of these things. Behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you're clothed with power from on high. And he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And while he blessed them, he left them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple blessing God. The reality of the ascension of Jesus is exactly the opposite of what it seems like. It's not the absence of Christ. It's the increased, heightened presence of Jesus. It's not the loss of leadership and intimacy and protection of the one that they've come to know as God. All over Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, all over the New Testament, what you see is the infinite magnification of the leadership, intimacy, and protection of the one that they've come to know is God. What happens in the New Testament is it seems like the disciples have more of Jesus than they did when they had all of Jesus, when he was actually walking around with them, visible, tangible, audible. It seems like in the New Testament, the disciples had more of him than when they actually had all of him. The truth is, if you'll hear it, the ascension of Jesus is actually good news for us and for the whole world. But if we don't get what's going on here, we'll be stuck staring up at the clouds, wondering where Jesus is, wondering when he'll come back, and wondering what in the world we're supposed to do without him. So what really is the ascension? I have to do my semi-regular shout out to Tim Keller for this, because something I read of his, I don't remember if it was a commentary on Mark or what, but something that I read of Tim Keller's connected these three dots for me that make the whole thing make sense. And so I'm going to try to connect these three dots for you. And to do that, we're going to talk about the Minions movie, and we're going to talk about the shape of the Earth and Russian cosmonauts, astronauts, and we're going to talk about the Sound of Music. Does that make sense? You in for this? All right. So a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago now, Eloise was just old enough to understand like cartoons and movies and things like that. And so we, being the rookie parents that we are, we sat down to watch the Minions movie with Eloise. If you're not familiar with the Minions, they are the banana-looking, goggle-wearing little hyphens. I don't even know how else to describe them. They're these oblong tubes. They look like a canister of tennis balls, but with goggles on, right? That's the Minions. So we're watching this Minions movie, and I don't recommend you play a Minions movie for a child that's under 2, because even though there are parts of it that are very cute and endearing, there are also parts of it that are weirdly stressful for a children's movie. But we did. We watched it with her. And the thing that stuck out to me about the Minions movie is part of it takes place in the UK, and there's this scene where these 3 little yellow blobs are trying to steal the Queen's crown, the Queen of England's crown. And what I didn't know until after I was watching the movie was there's actually a throne of England. Did you know that? There's actually like the actual literal chair, the throne of England. And what that means is if you can get past security like these little minions did, you could sit in it. Like literally, you can go up the steps, ascend the throne of England, and sit down in the big chair. You could do that. Anyone could do that in theory, literally. But here's what's interesting. To ascend the throne, the spatial language about going up to the chair is literally true in the sense that it's a couple steps up to sit down in it. But ascending the throne is spatial language that's just a figure of speech describing the change in relationship that one has to the rest of England if they ascend the throne of England. To ascend the throne is literally to step up, to climb into a chair, but really it means you're stepping into a new role and a new way of relating to and responding to the people of the country. When you say ascend the throne, the spatial language isn't really the point. Ascension isn't space travel. God is not up. Biblically speaking, catch this, according to the Bible, God doesn't live in the heavens, the sky above us, the atmosphere, the stratosphere, the universe, the created universe. And here's how we know this, as just an aside. There was actually a first person to leave the earth, and he was a Soviet cosmonaut named Yuri. And it's rumored that, he went up out of the Earth's atmosphere and came back. And it's rumored that he said, I didn't see God up there. Now, that could be from his perspective. Maybe he was an atheist and he was proving a point. I went up to space where we all assumed God was. He's not up there. But that makes sense, right? Because we don't, as Christians, think that God is like hiding behind the moon, right? We live on a ball, according to popular opinion, and that means that directly above you from anywhere on the ball is out, not up. There is no such thing as up. It's all out. Maybe this will help. God doesn't relate to the world the way a man in an attic relates to the people that live downstairs. Does that make sense? God's not up there. You ever see Sound of Music? You ever see a play in general? The way that God relates to the created universe is more like the way the author of a play relates to the characters in that play. So think of The Sound of Music. Think about Maria and the Von Trapps and Mother Superior. They don't know who the author of the musical is. They don't know who created them and wrote their story. And they can't figure anything out about the author by exploring the stage. Even if they knew how to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, they wouldn't see him anywhere. The only way the characters can know anything about the author is if the author writes himself into the story. Does that make sense? The reason that you or I know anything about God is because he wrote himself into the story and interacted with the characters that he made. The author wrote himself into the play as Jesus Christ. But when Jesus ascended, it doesn't mean that he went to another part of the stage. Does that make sense to you? He's not just in the attic of the house where everyone else is living in. To say that Jesus ascended doesn't mean that he spatially went to another part of the universe. It doesn't say he was taken up into the heavens, the sky, the atmosphere. He was taken up into heaven. He's not in a different part of the universe. He has a different relationship to the universe. This starts to get at what ascension really means. The ascension for us is how he's able to keep the promise that he makes in baptism. Jesus has said to you that God's name is on your forehead and on your heart. You belong to him. He's never going to leave you alone. You don't have to see how far you can get in this life without him. You don't have to figure things out on your own. God doesn't want you to live any of your life without him. The promise of baptism is that he will be with you, alongside you, always. And what I want you to catch is, that's not possible without the ascension. See, Jesus was a real person, a real flesh and blood human person. He walked in our shoes, so he knows what it's like to live a life like ours. He knows what it's like to be hungry, to be tempted, to be tired. He knows what it's like to laugh and to cry. He knows what wine tastes like. He knows what grief and sorrow feel like. He's experienced our ups and downs. During his ministry, he lived a perfect life in our place, fulfilling all righteousness and showing us what it looks like to be people the way God wants people to be people. He showed us what real humanity is, what God had in mind when he created Adam and Eve and told them to take care of each other and to take care of the world that he had made. And when he was murdered, Jesus paid the penalty for your sins and mine, for the guilt and the shame and all of, for all of broken humanity. He took our punishment on himself. And when he was raised from the dead, he defeated death once and for all. And so now the grave itself has a hole in the bottom of it. And even though we die, we continue to live, just as if we're stepping through a doorway. Throughout all of this, everything that Jesus did, the whole time his disciples knew him, Jesus existed at one point in space at a time, one moment at a time. So when he was standing here, he wasn't standing here. You don't see that anywhere in the story of Jesus. When he was doing something over here, he wasn't doing something over here. He was always in one space at one time. When he ascended, he stepped outside of space and time. He didn't get taken up into the heavens, which is just far away in the up direction, if you want to think about it that way, to a different spot in the universe. When he ascended, he was taken up into heaven, which means he has a different relationship to the universe. To be at the right hand of the Father, to be on the throne, means that our shepherd, our substitute, our mediator, our sacrifice, our prophet, priest, and king can take and apply the benefit and the glory of what he did anywhere, anytime. He can be everywhere, all the time. Sometimes I think about what it would be like if Jesus was still here in a body as Jesus of Nazareth, like walking around with dusty feet. If Jesus was here, do you think he would be here? Like, catch what I mean by that. Like, if Jesus was still here as a person, one Jesus in the whole world, would he be like having coffee with you? Would he be riding in the car next to you as you go to your, as we show up to Mount Calvary Lutheran Church? Would he be sitting amongst 130 of us waiting to have communion with us? If Jesus was here, would he be in America? Where would he be? Like, my mind goes that he would probably still be in the Middle East trying to help people work out some of the problems that they have over there. If Jesus was here, he'd probably be where people needed his attention the most. Here's my point. Because he ascended, Jesus can actually keep the promise that he made to you in his baptism, in your baptism, which is no matter where you are in the world, whether you're in the kind of place that you would assume that he would be if he was here. Doesn't matter if you're in the kind of place that you assume he would be if he was here. No matter where you are in the world, no matter where you find yourself spiritually, we don't intend to go up and down in our faith, but it happens. No matter where your emotions go, no matter where your thoughts go, no matter what, he can keep his promise to you that he will never leave you alone, that he will be shoulder to shoulder with you as you face the day that you're walking into. Because of his ascension, the power and presence of Christ is unlimited. If you've been noticing a theme throughout the Sundays of Easter, this is all about how Jesus is with you. Jesus is with you. The Spirit is with you. God is with you. That's intentional, and that is the point of the New Testament. Christmas, the beginning of the gospel story about Jesus of Nazareth. Christmas is local. It's temporal. Easter is universal. It's infinite. It's eternal. Because of Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, the promise that he made to you at your baptism, that he will always be with you to the very end of the age as you go and do what he asked you to do, that promise, he can actually keep it. No matter where you are, he can be with you. He'll never stop loving you. He'll never leave your side. He'll never stop working in you and on you until you grow to become everything the Father has in mind for you. Because of his ascension, his power and presence are unlimited. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May he look upon you with his favor, give you his peace. Go in that peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.